I've been working at Etzanoa for a number of years now, and I'm sure you've all heard of it. This map shows a number of things. The areas in red are the official site records from the state of Kansas at the time I began, and there are 22 separate sites that got recorded over the years, and they're the product of various investigations. And this one is pretty revealing. This is the biggest one, the country club site. An informant was asked, well, how big is this site? And he said, oh, it extends all the way down to Madison Avenue. You can find stuff down there. So the southern border is this perfect east-west line. That's Madison Avenue. The north-south line, how far east does it go? Oh, roughly to Country Club Road. So these are accidents of history. And when I began to look at the Spanish documents in detail, the area shown in white, it became obvious that a whole bunch of eyewitnesses from 1601 said this was one big town on both sides of the river, a continuous town. And one person specified that it was just about 2 Spanish leagues long. That'd be 5 1/4 miles. And it's about 5 miles long. So the actual back in time size of this town is shown. The areas in blue are places that have been reported to us since we began work there. Occasionally a landowner comes forward and says, oh yeah, there's stuff, I found stuff here and there. So you can see that the spaces in between will eventually fill up. So this town, according to the eyewitnesses, held roughly 20,000 people. Scholars way back when, back in the early 1900s, had access to some of these documents, and they all pretty much said, well, they must be exaggerating. Because at that time, someone from the Smithsonian had tried to estimate the total population of North America north of Mexico and came up with an estimate of 1 million people. If that were correct, would you believe one town in Kansas with 20,000, right? That's a big percentage. So, well, recently, I've been working with a number of museums in the state, and one of them is in Rice County. And they have had the best displays of Quiviran material. And I was there one day, and a woman walked in and handed me some maps made by her father back in the late 20s and 30s and 40s. And he used, later on, he used a county phone book. You remember those? We used to have them, where there are maps in the back with all of the properties. And he just would mark a spot with a pen wherever he found Quiviran material. And this turned out to be really, really important, because here are the officially recorded sites in Rice County. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over here on Cow Creek, and then more over here. A total of, I've forgotten how many, it doesn't matter. Horace Jones recorded 55 different places. Some of them coincide with the officially recorded sites, others don't. But this set did not correspond to eyewitness testimony from the Coronado expedition. One of the chroniclers said, well, if I remember right, we saw in this part of Quivira 6 or 7 communities on 2 streams and unoccupied territory in between. But you look at that and you don't see 6 or 7. You add in all of Horace Jones's little marks, and lo and behold, 7 large towns. And here's Etzanoa for scale. Okay, so you can see some of these towns are even bigger in size, spatial extent. So there are other such towns. There's north of Etzanoa, there's another big town, it's at least 5 miles long. And there's another one further up the river that's 3 miles. So all told, I'm counting 12 or 13 contemporaneous communities, roughly the size of Etzanoa, and we're right back to the original problem. Okay? It looks like Quivira held 200,000 people. The current conservative estimate for North America, north of Mexico, is 2 million. And so Quivira would have had 10%. That leads to a problem, right? To make it believable, there would have to be a good reason for them to have that many people. And that's what I really want to talk about. So, when the Oñate's people were at Etzanoa, the local folks said, oh, there are way more people upstream from here than live here. That this is one of the smaller towns. So we have native testimony and eyewitness accounts, and we've tried to estimate the land area, and that's an ongoing process. In the Kansas end of it, we got a pretty good idea, looking at collections from all over the place, that the southeastern portion of the state, everything south of the Kansas River, and then as you go west, even north of the Kansas River, maybe up into Nebraska, not sure of that. The Oklahoma end, Susan Vayak reported a number of campsites in the vicinity of Oklahoma City that have some diagnostic material, I'll put it that way. So the area that they controlled was, as it says there, it just happens to fall exactly in the midpoint, the median of size of European countries. It's a huge area, but remember there are lots of little countries in Europe. So, what I've been doing, it started off almost by accident, coming up with an explanation for this. So there are essentially 3 kinds of evidence I've run across. Some are just mentions of contact between people in Quivira and people elsewhere, without any mention of transactions of materials being exchanged. And there are a few of those. Then evidence of exports from Quivira. This turned out to be a mother lode. If you start looking, as I did, literally coast to coast, there are items that from Quivira that we're sure it came from Quivira, but you're not going to find them in archaeological sites because the important stuff was perishables: bison meat, hides, horns, rawhide, essentially almost every part of the animal. So the archaeological sites out there don't have much. For imports to Quivira, we're not going to see the perishables again, but it's the amount of stuff that's coming from long distances away has just blown me away. It's not in the academic literature yet. It's in collections in people's basements and in local museums. And unfortunately, some of those collections, we don't know the particular site these items came from. But I'll show you some in just a bit. So, the De Soto expedition. This map shows you all of the places where De Soto's people ran into bison products. So they landed by Tampa Bay and went north, got lost in the swamps of Georgia, but they get up to the South Carolina line, and scouts find a village and report back, and they bring back cow horns. Well, there were no cattle in North America at the time. And then a short distance further on, the town of Talamaco, in a temple complex, a room full of rawhide shields, helmets, and body armor, described as being from a very far country. Okay. Then they went up into the Appalachians and sent some people up towards a place called Chiscas. They never quite got there, but from some neighboring town they brought back one bison robe, just one. And then they went on southeast. They get to a place called Alabama. That was one of the battles they fought. And there's a description of a warrior wearing a bison horn helmet or headdress. And then they got to eastern Arkansas, and at Koski, there were there was a row of bison heads on the temple there. And at Pakaha, there were so many rawhide shields that De Soto was able to armor all of his horses. And then they went started going west. They got to Kaliwa, and there were robes there in the town, but not many. And then as they get to Tula, and there's hundreds and hundreds of bison robes. So there's a gradient here, and Tula was the only place in the vicinity of Tula where they observed bison meat that they identified as such. So where was this stuff coming from? And the answer is they heard about two places that had bison. By the time they got to Arkansas, they were ready to go home. They had lost about half of their men by that time. And were hoping to find the Pacific Ocean so they could go south and get to what they called New Spain. And when they got to Pakaha here, De Soto sent out a couple of exploring expeditions, get this, trying to find the South Sea. That was their name for the Pacific, right? And so he sent some horsemen north to try to find the South Sea. I just love that. It makes no sense at all until you have to read between the lines. They were, as about everybody in Europe was convinced, that somewhere on the north of the equator there was going to be the equivalent of the Straits of Magellan. The Spaniards called it the Strait of Anian, a ocean connection between the Atlantic, which they didn't call the Atlantic yet, and the Pacific, somewhere to the north. So these horsemen went 6 or 7 days north. How far that was, I really can't tell. And they met a few people, and they asked them what lay ahead, and they said, oh, there's this really distant place way up north. It's really cold. There are hardly any people, but there are cattle there. Now, if you read the archaeology of the upper Mississippi Valley, you'll find out they're talking, at this time frame, they're talking about Minnesota. There were no bison east of the Mississippi in 1541. So that was, but the odds of all of this stuff coming from a place with very few people is pretty low. The other place is implied here. At Keowate, they were told it was 11 days to where the bison were, in a place with really big towns and level sandy ground. And then as they begin to go west, they get here, and it's 6 or 7 days more, or 5 or 6, pardon me, and they get all the way to Tula, and the bison are described as nearby, though they never saw a live one. And again, they were told that the bison are in a place with large towns to the northwest. So the bison are coming from this part of the plains. And in 1541, the Pawnee were not yet in what's considered their traditional homeland in the Loup River Valley. They're still somewhere up in South Dakota. We really don't know exactly where or how many places they were in. And that's kind of secondhand from me reporting what the archaeologists who have worked in that area and are interested in that issue tell me. The Osage also were not in western Missouri at that time. Okay? And the latest work on the Digian speakers, so the Osage and the related tribes of Quapaw, the suggestion is about 1650 for the Quapaw to reach the mouth of the Arkansas. So that leaves essentially the Missouri, okay, with a big town in Missouri, the Utes site, but the descriptions we get of the place this comes from is large towns. And specifically, not in this set of documents, but in others, they describe the really tall houses that those people lived in. And you can go outside and visit the reproductions. You see a really, really tall house. So most of these products were coming from Quivira. Turning to Florida, the first eyewitness account of a bison in Florida is 1686. But this young man, I say young man, he was Hernando Escalante Fontaneda, was about 15 years old when he was shipwrecked in the Florida Keys, and he lived for 17 years among the Calusa as a captive, kind of the chief's pet in a way. I mean, if you read his account, that's pretty much what he was. And he wrote a number of documents about his experiences. One is a list of the fauna of Florida that does not include bison. But he did write that the natives told him that the Appalachee up in the panhandle of Florida eat deer and foxes and woolly cows. Now, woolly cows is a giveaway. Deer, that's not a surprise. It took me a while to figure out foxes. I mean, there's not enough meat on a fox to think about. But in the De Soto expedition, it's very clear that the natives of the southeast raised a breed of dogs, of small dogs that did not bark. And De Soto's men became really fond of eating that meat. So it's probably what was meant. And he also said about the Calusa country that after the summer, when nobody wants to be outside exerting themselves, there comes some, and this is an interpretation of the Spanish shamans, with some horns on their heads, howling like wolves and looking like the devil. These are the people that are sent out to challenge another town to the ball game. The face and body painted half red and half black and wearing bison horn helmets on their heads. The little brother of war. I mention that because the bison bull became an important symbol of war continent-wide. So, bison there, and then maybe my favorite of all, John Sharp was a common English sailor who was with John Hawkins on his fourth voyage to the New World, and they stopped at Fort Caroline and visited the French colony there a matter of weeks before the Spanish destroyed it. And Sharp wrote that some of the sailors traded with the French soldiers for the horn pendants that the Timucuan warriors wore. And the Frenchmen thought they were from unicorns. Yeah. So I can't prove that's bison, but there were no other horned animals. There were no horned animals living in Florida at the time. Okay, Imports from the East. This is a spectacular thing that the State Historical Society dug up at Etzanoa. It's a grooved mall made out of Missouri fire clay. So it's a ceremonial object. You're not going to be able to smash a bison bone with that. And clearly it was in a fire and got broken up. So fire clay comes from this part of Missouri. Number two, this tobacco pipe up in the upper left-hand corner. That's an Oneota style pipe. And I attribute it to the Utes site because the Utes site has 2 Wichita pipes in it, in the collection there. It could have been from another Oneota site, I can't prove it. There's a variety of flint or chert from the Crescent Hill Quarry in St. Louis that's very distinctive with batches of color. In all of my years in Kansas, I've seen 3 pieces of that stuff, all of them from Quiviran collections. Then Nodina points, this is a blow up, they're about this big, very distinctive style from what's called the Nodina phase, right in the part of Arkansas where De Soto's men were visiting. And then this is the Neosho phase and Fort Smith phase. I'll mention this one, another Quiviran style pipe there. And then Caddo country down here in East Texas and into Arkansas, pottery and pipes, lots more than is in the academic literature. It's a whole lot more. So they're getting plenty of stuff from the East, and they are sending bison products east. If we go to the West, this is the one that really stunned me. Okay, the Cabrillo expedition of 1540, this was a little flotilla, 3 ships that sailed up the west coast of Baja California and up the coast of California, maybe as far as Oregon. And they got to Isla San Martin here, okay, so off the west coast of Baja California, they found an archaeological site. They specified there was nobody there. It's still an uninhabited island. But they found what I'm pretty sure was a shrine with 2 cow horns. And to make sure that you know that it wasn't something else, they get up to the area of San Diego and they report seeing some really big sheep horns. So the desert bighorn, they recognize as sheep. These were cow horns. That island is essentially, it's a volcanic cone that sticks out of the ocean. And in native Mexican traditions, water in a mountain, especially a conical mountain, is always a special place. That's why I think there was a site there that was a shrine. And then Hernando Alarcón was sent with ships to support the Coronado expedition, but he never met up with Coronado. But he came up the Gulf and then went up the Colorado River in a small boat and a little ways up the Gila River. And sort of at the far end there, he met a man that he could converse with through a translator. And that guy told him that, well, he asked him, he said, where are you getting the leather for these, or rawhide for these big round shields? And the guy proceeds to describe a bison. Very accurate description, there's no doubt. He even gets to the point they're really big feet for this kind of animal. And he also said, and in that country, in the summertime, people live in tents made out of painted hides, teepees. And in the wintertime, in these really tall houses with a wood framework. And he specifies more than 1 story tall. Now, your reproduction out here doesn't have a second story, but the accounts of Etzanoa describe that the houses with 4 center posts could have, over the horizontal stringers, planks, and actually have a ladder on the outside of the house and another door leading to that upper platform. Closer in the west, you have the Pueblos. And all of these places have been identified as the sources for pottery that shows up in Quiviran sites. And for the archaeologist in the room here, what's of interest is that these sites, the Salinas and Humano Pueblos, no pottery in Quivira. The places that people have been arguing, oh, they're trading with the plains. And, well, no evidence for it of this sort. So loads of pottery, and this one is really interesting. The style of pottery there that's been identified in Kansas is called, it's easy to understand, El Paso polychrome. Right? So El Paso is here. Right? It is the northernmost, by far, example of that pottery ever found, by hundreds of miles. And then the other items from the Southwest, lots and lots and lots of them, and I'll show you a picture. So here are some of the items that are going to be on display in the McPherson Museum. This style of axe, very, very special. It's a stone called sillimanite. It's fairly rare. It's a really tough stone. Okay, so it's perfect for making an axe. And as you can see, this has a special groove. It's a spiral groove. And this end has been used as a hammer. Originally, it would have had a diagonal blade on it. The material comes from near Picarus Pueblo. These 2 items, the upper right, are shaft smoothers. I'm changing the Southwestern name because life gets confusing. Those are for making arrow shafts out of reeds, not out of wood. Okay? In the Great Plains, since 500 AD or so, people were using red willow and wood like that to make wooden arrow shafts, and you have shaft abraders made out of sandstone. So here's a question. Why would anybody in the Great Plains adopt somebody else's technology to make arrow shafts? And the answer is, well, if you're living in a little village, getting enough red willow twigs is not going to be a big deal. But in a town of 20,000 people, half of whom are males, and every male above the age of 8 is going to have a quiver full of arrows. They're made in batches of 10. If you do the math, you come up with, well, on a given day, there were 480,000 arrows in use or being carried around. They needed another technology, and they borrowed it. They also borrowed this from the Southwest. This is a fairly rare kind of grinding stone in the Southwest. I hope you can see there's a ridge here. It's got 2 facets, and those are the grinding surfaces in the Southwest. And they're perfectly straight. You'd have to use them on a perfectly flat stone, and nobody really knows why they made this particular form. It's not terribly common there. This one was one of 3 in a collection. And my first reaction was, okay, somebody went to the Southwest. You don't get 3 of those. But then I looked closely at this one, and it has been modified. So my story is, Dad went to the Southwest and brought back these things for his wife, and she went, what am I going to do with this? It doesn't fit my grinding stone. So what somebody did was batter the ends of this to make it convex so that it would fit in the kind of grinding stones we find. And that's where all the wear is on this one. It's polished on the bottom from grinding corn. So she flipped it over and fixed it and used it. This green tobacco pipe is a typical southwestern form, just a perfect cylinder. It's of a stone called chlorite. Green chlorite pipes show up at Pecos Pueblo, among others. No surprise. This other one is as good a hybrid as you could ask. So it's a cylindrical pipe, as in the Southwest. It's got a sort of a fishtail flattened mouthpiece. That shows up at Pecos Pueblo, with a lot of pipes from Pecos. But the other end is decorated the way the Quivirans decorated their own pipes, with what looks like a collar, and it's got horizontal incisions on it. And the stone is Kansas pipestone. So somebody has taken, and these of course are ritual traditions, and combining them and making something entirely new. So lots and lots and lots of contact with the Southwest. In the North, not as much stuff. The written records start much later. So earliest written record is from 1738. But pieces of obsidian from Malad in, this would be southern Idaho, and from Obsidian Cliff in Yellowstone Park, but not much. Most of the obsidian is from New Mexico and one other place I'll tell you about in a bit. Contact, well, first of all, this is two sides of a broken tiny little piece of pottery that I looked at and went, oh, I think this might be from somewhere up north, but certainly nothing like we'd see in Kansas. So I showed it to, and again, for your sake, Dennis Toom, Mr. North Dakota Archaeology. And I said, have you ever seen anything like this? And he looked at it and he said, yeah, this is Knife River ware from this part of North Dakota, well up there where the Mandan and Hidatsa lived. You find hardly any of it in South Dakota. This is the southernmost piece of Knife River ware ever found. And then contact in 1719, a Frenchman named La Harpe visited some Wichitas in the vicinity of Tulsa. And the chief told him, well, our people used to trade with the Pueblos, but got cut off by the Apaches. And we used to trade with the Arikara, but got cut off by the Skeety Pawnee. Okay. So the Pawnee at that time were fairly recent arrivals, and at the end, even though, as you all know, they had a friendly relationship for a really, really long time, it was not that way at the beginning because they were intruding on Quiviran territory. So they visited the Arikara well to the north, and then we come, a little interlude before we get to the archaeology again. People who spoke the language of the Aztecs at the time of very first contact. All of these red dots are examples. The two with, if you can see the little circle around them, these are landmarks with Nahuatl names. Again, as recorded at the time of first contact. The best account that was hidden away was Cabeza de Vaca, who was shipwrecked on the shore of Texas, Galveston Island in the 1520s, along with a number of other people, and eventually he and 3 companions walked to Mexico, the long way around. So this is his route, from Galveston Island over here, to come down into Tamaulipas, and then went north and up the Rio Grande a while, and then over west, and then south. And he wrote book about his trip, and in one spot he mentioned that between Galveston Island and a town in the west that he names, there were 1,000 different people, villages, each with their own language, but all of them communicated in a single language in which you call your dog by saying, ho. And you get the attention of a person, saying, like, come here, by saying araka. I spent quite a while emailing linguists whose names I found online who studied Nahuatl and never got an answer from any of them. And then I went to the celebration of Dia de los Muertos in Wichita and found a guy from Guadalajara. And I said, oh, did anybody there speak Nahuatl anymore? He said, well, everybody does. And I said, really? And I've got some questions. And so I hit him up with, well, how do you call your dog? And he said, ho. And I said, okay, well, this guy said that. And he also wrote that araka means look over here or come here. And he said, no, it means welcome. So this was the language of international relationships, and the northernmost accounts come from Quivira. Coronado's two guides from Quivira both spoke some Nahuatl. El Turco spoke a little, Isopete spoke somewhat more. And a third guy, one account says, is from Quivira, was a young guy named Chabe. And those other names, those are Spanish nicknames. Chabe is not a Spanish word. It is a Nahuatl word. It's the name of a place originally. Today, it's a woman's name. And so if you want to go to Guadalajara, you can go to, I love this, Paeria Chabe. So this woman owns a paeria. It's like a taqueria, and it means, same as in English, it means it's a dessert shop. So I intend to go there. So loads and loads and loads of people all across this region, and certainly all the way down to Guatemala, who spoke Nahuatl. So communication was easy, and I wanted to make that clear because here are items from deeper south, stage one, if you will. So Cabeza de Vaca ran into some bison robes in Tamaulipas. He first noticed them. He got up to La Junta and he called the people who lived there the people of the cows, but they didn't hunt cattle there, but they did hunt, and he said they went 50 leagues to hunt bison, and if you go 50 leagues from there, you come to the Pecos River at a spot where it's not in a deep canyon, where animals would have had direct access to the water. So a good hunting territory. So the southernmost of the bison at about that time. And he said, yeah, they had robes there. When he got over here to Corazones, as he called it, there were gobs of bison robes. He had his 3 other companions, and by that time, a whole bunch of native people are following along with him. They're fascinated by these visitors who are being very nice to them. And they ran into a Spanish slaving expedition. And Cabeza de Vaca tried to stop those guys from taking these people as slaves by offering them all of the bison robes this entourage was carrying. It didn't work, but at least he tried. So lots and lots there. Then Fray Marcos, a few years, this would be 1539, comes north from Culiacan, and he gets to about here, and he sends somebody to the coast, just trying to find out where the coast is at that point. And the guy comes back with 2 warriors carrying big bison rawhide shields. And then 3 days north of there, he sees his first bison robe. And then in increasing numbers, and he gets up to about the present international border, and he said, I saw at least 2,000 bison robes in the last 3 days. So bison robes are being exported south from the Zuni country, but there are no bison in the Zuni country. These are robes that are coming from the plains in enormous quantities. And then finally, I was really amazed to find this one. Jean Guéry, Frenchman from La Salle's colony in Texas, short-lived colony. This guy deserted or got driven out, it's not really clear which, and he goes over to West Texas, and he's living with the natives there and having a grand time, apparently, and because he had a gun. By the time the Spaniards caught him, it was no longer operative, but they were terrified. They did not want natives to have access to firearms, and here was somebody living with the natives with a firearm. But at any rate, he mentions this place up north that he learned about from the natives there, where there's grassland with lots and lots and lots of bison, and the people live in really tall houses with more than one story. Right? So again, Quivira. And he also mentions, and I can imagine that people who live in that, if you've ever been to that part of Texas, it's a pretty bleak place. They told him, oh, those people have lots of provisions, lots of food. Good place to visit. Okay, that part of northern Mexico is, some scholars call it part of the greater Southwest. It's not the area of high cultures that's called Mesoamerica, but we've got Mesoamerican artifacts in Quivira. And they were collected at different times by different people, at least 4 sets of people, from 3 different places. And, okay, the Horn collection, we have a portion of a family collection that was donated to WSU, and I remember when it came in. And yeah, when we cleaned the artifacts, and there were 2 little bladelets of obsidian, and clear where they were from. It's greenish obsidian. It's from a source called Pachuca. And I shrugged them off. Right? We're taught to be cautious. And who knows? Those people were clearly not rich. The story that went with them, their main entertainment was to go to this one site. If the crop was not in the field after a heavy rain, they went after church on Sunday and collected stuff. Thousands of items. And I figured, oh, somebody gave them that. Right? Ignored it. Rob Swinson was a high school kid in the 1960s who collected from one site in Pratt County. That's an ancestral Quiviran site. And in his collection, there are 2 flakes of Pachuca. He didn't know what they were. They were just incidental. Then Mr. Davis, and recorded this 1965, this person, a local journalist, gave 3 obsidian cores to a woman who taught archaeology at McPherson College. She held on to them for years, and when she retired, she handed them to me and said, well, maybe you can figure this out because you've worked on the Coronado expedition. I didn't know quite what to do with them. And I told her, I said, oh, somebody was pulling your leg. No, they're not from the Coronado expedition. They didn't have that much obsidian left by the time they got to Kansas. And she said, well, he was a really serious guy. I'll write to him. And the upshot of that was I got a letter from him. At the time, he was in the hospital dying of cancer. And he recounted where he found them, exactly where in the Paint Creek site. after heavy rain, and he sent along this other object, and he said, I don't know what this is, but it was right in the same area with those. And so at that point I became a believer, not because of the 3 cores of obsidian, but this cylindrical object turned out to be an artifact from central Mexico. And at that time in the state of Kansas, as far as I can tell, there was exactly one person who would be able to recognize what it was. And that happened to be a colleague at the time at WSU, Lisa Overholzer, who worked at the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. So I brought it down and showed it to her. I said, have you ever seen anything like this? And she said, oh, practically every day. I went, what? She said, that's a byproduct of making jars out of stone. They use this onyx, and they would use a reed drill with sand and water, and you make essentially a hole that's solid stone inside, and you whack it with another stone, and you have a cylinder that you throw away. Only they didn't throw them away. They would sell them in the market to jewelers who made earplugs for people to wear. And the obsidian cores that look like this, so here's the set of stuff that Mr. Davis found. These obsidian cores, that's also Pachuca obsidian. That's the main source for Tenochtitlan. Those are used up pieces of obsidian. They've gotten too small to bother with any more. Those were sold in the marketplace to other jewelers who made librettes and other forms of jewelry. So one way to look at this is, these are some cheap souvenirs from somebody's trip to Tenochtitlan. Although we have more than that. And we also have, and it's marked here, the Rice County Museum. We talked them into sending 3 pieces of obsidian to get an analysis of the source, and one of them turned out to be from the Santa Barbara mountain in Jalisco. Right? So really far away. So if you add all of that up, this is what you get. So the numbers here are distances in kilometers. The black lines, the few black lines are like this one here is the Auricera, notice of contact, but no information about what flowed. Blue lines are exports, red lines are imports. And when you put all of the evidence together, that Mesoamerican stuff doesn't really stand out that much, right? So Pachuca source is 2,050 kilometers from Quivira. The Calusa, 2,040 kilometers. That's a difference of 6 miles. What's missing, okay, hardly anything up north where exploration was a whole lot later, and really nothing over here where the exploration was really late. But evidence that Quivira was not only at the physical center of what's now the United States, but at the economic center back in the day. And not only the biggest place in terms of area, the biggest place in terms of population, but the most important place in terms of economics in native North America, north of Mexico. You see why I wanted to tell you about it.